On May 11th, 2007, 16-year-old Kevin Haynes practically bounced with excitement on his seat on the bus as he headed home from Manheim Township High School outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His older sister Maggie had just come home from college the day before, and their dad was going to make his signature spaghetti and meatballs to celebrate her return. And if the Haynes family followed their tradition, they would also rent a family video after dinner and then maybe watch the Philadelphia Phillies baseball game. Kevin thought his Friday night lineup sounded great. Kevin and his sister Maggie were not super close, partly because Maggie was 4 years older, but Kevin looked up to Maggie. She was cool and stylish and so athletic, she actually ran for the Bucknell University track team. And Maggie admired her brother right back, even bragging about him to her college friends. Kevin was a straight-A student in his school's gifted program and a member of the school's Quiz Bowl team, which competed against other high schools to show who was the smartest. And his big sister had plans to make Kevin even better. This summer, she had promised to fix his nerdy fashion sense. She told him no more knee-high white socks with khaki shorts. Kevin chuckled to himself as he rode along at the idea that his sister was going to fix him. He was a very modest young man, his round face turning bright whenever he became the center of attention. And he would never brag. But Kevin knew that he was doing a lot of things right already. He was close to getting his Eagle Scout badge from the Boy Scouts, and he had just passed his driver's test. He was a homebody by nature, but he was emerging as a young man ready to take on the world. The evening before, he had gone to a meeting at his school about a class trip to Germany in July. Kevin's family, like so many in eastern Pennsylvania, traced their ancestry to Germany, and Kevin had always dreamed of visiting. Finally, it was actually happening, and, best of all, his roommate on the trip would be one of his two best friends, Alec Kreider. Now, on the bus, he and Alec chatted excitedly about all the things they planned to do in Berlin, Germany's capital. When Kevin waltzed into the kitchen of his family's neatly kept middle-class home that Friday afternoon, he plopped his backpack down onto a chair and went to the refrigerator to look for a snack. He was daydreaming about Germany and pulling out the blueberry pie when his sister Maggie walked in and reminded him they needed to get Mother's Day cards for their mom. So Kevin wolfed down his pie, and then the pair drove off to a nearby strip mall to shop for cards. Kevin and Maggie often joked about how perfectly boring their family was, comparing themselves to the Cleaver family from the 1950s TV show Leave It to Beaver. Their father, Tom Haynes, was an industrial supply store manager who loved his work, while their mom, Lisa Haynes, taught preschool at a church school. None of them did drugs or drank much alcohol, and neither Kevin nor Maggie had ever had a serious romance. On Sundays, they all went to church. The Haynes family also prided themselves on leaving their doors unlocked, except when they went away for vacation. Their town was on the edge of Amish country, where the straight-laced Amish people still travel in horse-drawn wagons, and crime was so rare that many of their neighbors did the same thing. In Manheim Township, people felt safe. But a boring lifestyle worked just fine for Kevin, Maggie, and their parents. They enjoyed each other's company and looked forward to being together. Both Maggie and Kevin were back at the house by the time their father, Tom, came blazing in promptly at 5 to start getting dinner ready. Tom had recently had surgery for prostate cancer, and he still had a catheter implanted, but you'd never know it by his good cheer and energy. At 5:30, the whole family gathered around the dining room table for pasta and lots of catching up. It was Kevin's mom, Lisa's, last day of preschool, and she had been touched by the gifts that her preschool students had given her. She planned to write notes back to all of her little scholars. Maggie talked about her professors at Bucknell, some she loved, others not so much, and everyone at the table talked about how glad they were that Maggie was home. They had missed her last summer when she stayed at college to work on a biology project. Kevin loved the dinner. His dad had a magic touch with the meatballs. But Kevin didn't love the family movie that night. Maggie and his mother had picked out a romantic comedy at the local video store, and Kevin groaned as soon as his mom pulled it out of the bag. He tried to watch it, but the film seemed sentimental and dumb to him, and he could feel his eyelids drooping about halfway through. So, not long after 9 p.m., Kevin told his family that he loved them, but he needed to go to bed. Maggie teased her brother as he headed for the stairs, saying he might be the only teenager alive going to bed so early. but Kevin didn't mind. He was going to read until he fell asleep. Maggie and her parents watched the rest of the movie. Then Maggie and her father stayed up a bit longer to watch the Philadelphia Phillies beat the Chicago Cubs. By 11, everyone retired to their bedrooms, passing Kevin's darkened room along the hallway. Tom and Lisa quickly fell asleep, but their daughter Maggie was still on a college student schedule. She watched TV programs on her laptop and then chatted online with college friends until she finally nodded off around 1 a.m. An hour later, at a little after 2 a.m., Maggie was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of screaming. There were no words, just the ear-splitting screams of a man, along with loud thuds as if people were wrestling. And all these sounds were coming from her brother's bedroom. Totally confused and now trembling with fear, Maggie grabbed her glasses from off the nightstand and stepped into the hallway to investigate. But the terrible noises coming from Kevin's room made her so scared that Maggie just ran back inside her bedroom, slammed the door, and sat with her back pressed against it. She tried desperately to make sense of what was happening amid all the screeching. Was there an intruder in the house who was attacking her brother? And if there was, what hope did she have of preventing the intruder from breaking into her room next? She couldn't just sit there and wait. So Maggie summoned all her courage and ran across the hall to her parents' room where the light was on. Her father was lying motionless while her mother was sitting at the end of the bed, hunched over and crying hysterically. When Lisa Haynes saw her daughter, she told her in a voice barely above a whisper, "Go get help." Maggie didn't need to be told twice. She ran wildly down the stairs and out into the cool spring night, banging on one neighbor's door after another until finally one woman turned on a light and let her inside. Maggie told her that she had no idea what was going on inside of her house, but judging from her mom's hysterics, she feared it had something to do with her father's prostate cancer. And so whatever was going on, Maggie said, we need the police right now. Officer Steve Newman, working the night shift just weeks after finishing the police academy, got to the scene first. He went straight to the neighbor's house where Maggie had made the 911 call. Maggie was teary-eyed and dressed in a sweatshirt decorated with a cartoon penguin, and she was totally confused about what was going on in her house across the street. She said her dad might be having some kind of health crisis, or maybe there was a home invasion going on. When Newman left the neighbor's home and went across the street and rang the doorbell on the Haynes family home, no one answered. So he opened the unlocked door and went inside, mindful that an intruder could be lurking in the darkness. On the first floor, Newman, along with a second officer, saw nothing unusual except that the glass sliding door in the kitchen was open. Otherwise, the house was still. But as Newman climbed the stairs, gun drawn, he saw a spot of blood. Then he saw two more further up. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could see bloody footprints on the hallway carpet, and there, in the doorway of his bedroom, lay Kevin Haynes in his Boy Scout t-shirt, face down in a pool of blood. Newman could see that his throat and face had been severely slashed, while his arms were covered with knife wounds as though he had put up a desperate fight to live. Both officers continued down the hall to Kevin's parents' room. There, they found Tom Haynes lying on his back on the bed, eyes staring up at the ceiling, deep stab wounds to his chest. At the end of the bed, curled up in the fetal position, lay Lisa Haynes. Lisa was still warm, and for a moment, Newman hoped she might be alive, but then he saw the deep gash on her throat. All three were dead. Detective Alan Lead grabbed the phone on the second ring when the 911 dispatcher called a little after 3 a.m. The 57-year-old detective called himself the old dog of the Manheim Township Police, and he had plenty of experience answering emergency calls in the middle of the night. Bald and bespectacled, Lead could pass for a high school teacher, but in reality, he was a hardened investigator who had just finished investigating a shooting at a local tavern the day before. He was also a veteran of the Vietnam War who had learned a valuable lesson a long time ago: treat people the way you would want to be treated. The other detectives looked up to Lead, and they often went to him for advice about their cases. The dispatcher told Lead that something terrible had happened at 85 Peach Lane. Lead did a double take when he heard the address. Peach Lane was in one of the most peaceful and pleasant neighborhoods in the whole town, an area where police were seldom called. He asked the dispatcher if it was some sort of domestic disturbance, and they just said, "No, that's not what happened. You'd better get over there." Lead knew that the crime scene unit was poring over the crime scene, cataloging all the evidence. They didn't need Lead's help with that. He could check out the scene later. Right now, Lead needed to talk to the only surviving witness, Maggie. And by now, Maggie was on her way to the police station. So Lead got dressed, jumped in his car, and headed into the office. Maggie was already in an interview room talking to another detective when Lead arrived, and the detective excused himself to brief Lead on how it was going. The whole conversation was making him uncomfortable, the detective said. Maggie seemed relaxed and chatty, and she kept talking about her family in the present tense as though they were not dead. The detective said she didn't seem like a woman who had just lost her entire family. Lead looked through the one-way glass into the room where Maggie was still sitting, occasionally looking up and smiling in their direction. Other times, she smoothed her hair and sat with her hands folded on her lap as though she was just awaiting instructions. The other detective was right. She certainly did not seem heartbroken. But Lead said that the most important thing they could do right now would be to get as much information out of Maggie as they could. For all they knew, the killer could be planning to strike again, so time was of the essence. He asked the detective to get a written statement from Maggie that included everything she could remember about the evening, no matter how minor it seemed to her. The tiniest detail could turn out to be a critical clue. So the detective set Maggie up with a laptop computer and gave her an assignment. Tell us what happened. And Maggie took it to heart, typing page after page about everything that took place since she returned home from college. She wrote about the TV shows she watched and how her parents didn't understand the TV show Grey's Anatomy. She wrote about doing a crossword puzzle with her mother, and she wrote about the score in the Phillies game that she watched. But when Maggie got to the moment that she heard screaming from her brother's bedroom, her account became less and less specific. She never saw the intruder. She didn't realize her parents had both been stabbed even though she was in their bedroom with the lights on, and she never investigated what was causing all the noise in her brother's bedroom. When she needed to describe her reaction to learning that her family was dead, she wrote simply, quote, "And you know the rest," end quote. Lead and the other detectives didn't know what to think. Some details in Maggie's statement were touching, depicting an unusually close family. But it's a basic principle in police investigation that when a witness fills their statement with irrelevant details, they may not be telling the whole story. Lead didn't think of Maggie as a suspect, but it did seem odd that the killings came just 2 days after she returned home from college and that she was miraculously spared. It was also strange that she had seen so little of the loud, bloody attack unfolding all around her in her home. But Lead thought to himself that Maggie's performance was so bad that she had to be telling the truth. After all, if Maggie was connected to the crime in any way, wouldn't she put on a major display of grief to cover her tracks? As dawn broke over Mannheim Township, Lead was facing perhaps the most appalling murder case in his town's history, and he had little more to go on than the quirky personality of the lone survivor. The slaughter of a respectable family in a picture-perfect neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked was an irresistible story to the national news media. By late on Saturday, May 12th, the same day as the murders, the crime was on CNN and other big national networks, all of them pointing out that the killer or killers were still at large. The people of Mannheim Township were scared that a psychotic killer was on the loose in their community, and police started giving Maggie around-the-clock security protection. For Alan Lead and the other detectives working the case, the media coverage triggered dozens of calls from people who said they knew something about the crime, but almost certainly didn't. One woman called to report 3 Hispanic men in a black Chevy cruising the neighborhood near the crime scene. Perhaps they were involved. A man called to report 2 young people dressed in goth clothing who spit on him. Maybe they were the killers. One couple who called in actually volunteered the use of their bloodhound dog, Nellie, which initially seemed like a smart idea to Lead. So Lead let Nellie sniff blood spatters at the crime scene and then turned her loose. And Nellie took her handlers, as well as the police, on a zigzagging tour of the business district before finally leading them to a burger restaurant that Nellie thought smelled delicious. And it was at this point that her handlers admitted that Nellie very likely had no idea where the Haynes' killer had fled. The police had no solid suspects, but their crime scene investigation at least gave them some clues. It appeared that the killer, or killers, had struck the parents first, then savagely attacked their son, Kevin, leaving blood everywhere, including on the bottom of the killer's shoes. That's what left the bloody footprints in the upstairs hall. If they could find the shoes that matched the prints, they would have their killer. Despite the extreme violence, there was no sign of robbery. Lisa Haynes' jewelry and other valuables in the house were undisturbed. Whoever killed the family had likely targeted them for some reason other than money. And the viciousness of the attack on Kevin specifically made police suspect that Kevin might have been the primary target. There was also one other disturbing detail at the crime scene. They found blood in the downstairs bathroom, as though the killer had taken the time to clean up before leaving the murder scene. Their killer, it seems, was not remotely in a hurry. Maggie's role in all of this, if any, remained a mystery. Almost immediately, rumors spread that a former boyfriend of Maggie's could be the killer, but Maggie had never had a serious boyfriend. Lead asked an FBI analyst to read Maggie's written statement to see if he saw signs of deception about the murders. The analyst said they did not. And so it seemed to Lead that people were gossiping about Maggie mainly because she was the only family member to survive. The police began interviewing everyone who knew the family, hoping that they might gain some insight into who would want to hurt them. But the Haynes family were a tough family to hate. Person after person reported how decent and friendly they all were and how they always tried to do the right thing. Kevin had two best friends, Alec, who he was going to Germany with, and Warren Tobin, who he had known since elementary school and ate lunch with in the school cafeteria most days. These three were so close that they called themselves the Three Musketeers. If anyone would know who might hate Kevin and his family enough to kill them, it would be Alec or Warren. But the detective who called them came away with few concrete leads. Warren, who was choking back tears, said that Kevin got along with everyone. He said Kevin didn't socialize much, but he was always helpful to his classmates and no one seemed to pick on him. Warren said all of the Haynes family members were extremely nice and he couldn't understand why they had been attacked. Kevin was even closer to Alec, who lived just a half-mile away. Not only were they going to Germany together, but they were well known at the high school for their good-natured cafeteria debates about everything from religion to politics. But Alec said he was just as baffled as Warren. When Warren called him on Saturday with the horrible news, Alec said he initially thought Warren was just making a terrible joke. He said he couldn't think of a single person with a bad opinion of Kevin, except for perhaps a couple of students in math class who occasionally teased him. But it seemed like no big deal to Alec. In all their interviews, police found only one trace of ill will towards the Haynes family. One of Tom Haynes' co-workers said that Tom, in his role as a manager, had recently threatened a new employee with firing if his performance didn't improve. The co-worker said the two men got into an angry discussion behind closed doors in Tom's office, but when one of Lead's detectives tracked down this new employee, he denied there had ever been any shouting or even any anger. And he had a perfect alibi. He and his wife were out late with another couple the night of the murders. So it was another dead end. Then, on May 15th, so 3 days after the murders, Lead got a call from an alert trooper in North Carolina who had pulled over two men in their 20s for speeding and then discovered they had been smoking marijuana as well. One of the men volunteered, while high, that they were heading for Florida after, quote, getting away with murder in Pennsylvania, end quote. The trooper was aware of the Haynes family murders, and so he searched this vehicle closely until he found a knife. Both of these men were locked up in the Johnson County Jail, the trooper told Lead, if he wanted to send someone to question them. For the first time in 4 days, Alan Lead felt hopeful, and he practically skipped out of his office into the squad room to tell the other detectives about this new hot lead. He told them how one of these suspects even had lacerations on his right hand. The guy claimed the injury was from a sawmill, but those cuts could also come from violently murdering people. Lead told his team, "We may have our killers." At Lead's request, the FBI had already done an analysis of the bloody footprints in the hallway. They came from size 12 Hush Puppies, a casual shoe brand. So Lead called the Johnson County jailer and asked him to send a photocopy of the soles of the two men's shoes. The jailer was happy to oblige, and a few minutes later, Lead received a fax from North Carolina. The pictures were disappointing. The two men were wearing sneakers, not Hush Puppies, and neither was a size 12. But Lead knew they could still be the killers, so he asked for a DNA sample from both of the jailed men that could be compared with DNA from the crime scene. Once again, the jailer was happy to help, and once again, the results were disappointing. A few days later, the crime lab told Lead that none of the DNA from the men in jail in North Carolina matched the crime scene. They were not the murderers. Feeling very discouraged, Lead thought to himself, maybe they were thinking about this case all wrong. The FBI had told investigators that the murders had the earmarks of a crime by someone who knew their victims, not a crime committed by strangers. The killer or killers had used a knife, which is a very intimate murder weapon, and the attack on Kevin seemed an act of pure hatred. And whoever had done this did seem to know their way around the house, likely knowing that the Haynes did not lock their doors. Maybe, Lead thought to himself, investigators needed to keep looking closer to home. On May 19th, so a week after the murders, people crowded into the Otterbein United Methodist Church for a memorial service for the Haynes family. It was a church that had long been at the center of the family's life. Kevin's grandmother was one of the church's founders, while Tom had served as a trustee. The crowd grew so large that volunteers hastily set up folding chairs at the back of the church to accommodate the overflow. All the while, a Pennsylvania state trooper videotaped everyone coming in the door, and local police were stationed all over the building just in case the killer might reveal themselves. Moments before the service was about to start, Detective Lead escorted Maggie and her other family members into the church, where they somberly took a seat in the front row. The entire chamber immediately fell silent, except for the sobs of Warren Tobin's sister. The pastor spoke about the mystery of evil and the promise of the afterlife for the faithful Tom, Lisa, and Kevin Haynes, providing some comfort amid such a staggering loss. But then the pastor invited Lisa Haynes' brother to the podium, and his message sent a shiver through the entire congregation. He talked about the profound impact the murders were having on the Haynes family, as well as the larger community, and he called on the killer to come forward and ask Maggie for forgiveness. He said the killer might even be here right now at this memorial service, posing as a grieving friend or loved one. For Kevin's friend, Alec, who was seated with the German teacher who would have chaperoned Alec and Kevin to Germany that summer, the message that the killer might be in that room was overwhelming. By the time the service was over, Alec had balled up his fists, his face was glowering, and when several girls tried to comfort Alec and give him a hug, he grew rigid and stepped back. Alec stalked off to his father's car where he sat fuming, and when his dad got in, he asked what was going on. Alec said he was furious at all the hypocrites in the service who never cared about Kevin when he was alive, but now that he was dead, everyone was acting so sad in public like he mattered to them. But he didn't. They didn't care. And in fact, Alec was now convinced, like Lisa Haynes' brother, that the killer had to be one of those hypocrites. They were there in the church. He knew it. By May 22nd, so 10 days after the murder, Lead and his team were no closer to making an arrest, and the detectives were starting to disagree amongst themselves about how to move forward. Several believed that Maggie had not told them everything she knew. Maybe Maggie was not involved in the crime, but she could be holding back details about the family's history or something that happened on the night of the murder that could help them solve the case, and so they wanted to bring Maggie back to the police station for more questioning. Lead didn't like the idea. Maggie had answered their questions over and over again, often giving investigators more details than they really wanted. What more could she have to say? And Lead feared that Maggie might have a serious emotional breakdown if they asked the same questions again as though they didn't believe her earlier answers. But Lead ran the team like a democracy, and when the other detectives outvoted him, he agreed to question Maggie one more time. At 11 a.m. that morning, Lead walked into an interview room and sat down across from a now somewhat resentful Maggie Haynes. But to Lead's surprise, Maggie did have more to say. As Lead asked question after question in his gentlest voice, Maggie energetically responded. As Maggie recalled the unfolding attack on her family, she said she could smell the blood when she stepped from her bedroom out into the hall. When she got to her parents' room, she couldn't see any blood, she said, but her mother was so upset that when she asked her to go get help, Maggie didn't ask any questions. She just went and got help. In the moments after Maggie had learned that her parents and brother were dead, she said the first person she wanted to call was the head of her prayer group at college. She wanted to know why God would let something so terrible happen. And then Maggie started to cry. By the time she walked out of the police station, Alan Lead was convinced of two things. One, Maggie had nothing to do with the crime. And two, she had told them everything she knew. Over the next 2 weeks, tips about the Haynes murders continued to come into police, but the results were much the same. They put a microphone on one informant who claimed that a guy named Amani had confessed to invading the Haynes' home and then, quote, taken care of, end quote, the people inside. But after 2 weeks of eavesdropping on Amani's conversations, all police heard about was Amani bragging about women, drugs, and guns. He did not seem to know anything about a triple murder. Meanwhile, one of Kevin's best friends, Alec Kreider, who had become really angry at the memorial service, convinced the killer was amongst them, he started to break down. In the first days after the killing, his parents worried that he was keeping his grief about Kevin's death inside, becoming even more silent and withdrawn than usual. Alec had never had an easy time expressing his feelings, and he didn't have a lot of close friends aside from Kevin and Warren. And then, in early June, 3 weeks after the murder, Alec began talking about suicide on the phone with a girl he had a crush on. Her name was Carolyn. On June 5th, he told Carolyn he had a loaded gun and he didn't think he was going to make it through the week. Carolyn's heart started racing when she heard this because she feared Alec really was going to kill himself, maybe even on the phone with her at that very minute. She managed to get the attention of her aunt who lived with her, and she let her know that she had a suicidal boy on the phone. Carolyn gave her aunt Alex's address and said she had to go there to warn Alex's mother. Carolyn then kept Alec on the phone until her aunt spoke to Alex's mom, and Alex's mom called 911. When Alec finally came out of his bedroom, there were several police officers waiting who tackled him and then handcuffed him to prevent him from hurting himself. Detective Lead had come with the 911 response when he heard the call, in part because he knew Alec better than anyone else in the department from the Haynes investigation. Lead walked next to Alec as he was gently led out of the house towards a squad car, and as he walked, Lead put his arm around Alec and just said, how are you doing? And all Alec would say was, the world is a terrible place. As police helped Alec step into the squad car, Lead thought about the way the murders were totally upending the lives of the people who survived. Lead was convinced that Maggie was on the edge of a breakdown, and now one of Kevin's closest friends was cracking up. He couldn't help but agree with Alec. The world is a terrible place. The next day, on June 6th, Alec was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital to be held for at least a week. For the next 6 days, Alec was kept in a locked ward and not allowed to have any contact with anyone outside of the hospital except for his parents. All the while, Alec wrote letters that he intended to send to Caroline. Finally, on June 12th, Alex's parents were scheduled to come to the hospital for a family therapy session, and Alec was looking forward to seeing them. But Alex's parents had bad news. Carolyn did not want to have a romantic relationship with him. After all the suicide talk and threats of violence, Carolyn's aunt told them that the teen only wanted to be friends, nothing more. The second Alec heard this, he seemed to just crumple in his chair and let out a laugh that was anything but amused. He looked at his parents and told them bluntly to get out of the room. he needed to speak to his therapist alone. The therapist was only in the room with Alec for a few minutes before she emerged looking like she had seen a ghost. She told Alex's parents that Alec really needed to tell them something, and what Alec had to say would blow the Haynes family murder case wide open. Based on what Alec and his parents told investigators, here's what really happened to Tom, Lisa, and Kevin Haynes on the night of June 12th. A little after 1 a.m., the killer got dressed in dark clothes, including a baseball hat with duct tape over the team logo and hush puppy shoes. Then they grabbed a flashlight and a knife and began the relatively short walk to the Haynes' household. When they got there, the killer knew the door would be unlocked, so they opened it up and silently walked through the house, up the stairs towards the bedrooms. First, the killer went into the parents' room and quickly killed Tom Haynes with 2 deep stab wounds to the chest. The killer also stabbed Lisa Haynes, but she was still alive when the killer left the room. The killer then walked down the hall to Kevin Haynes' room, and he began stabbing him as he slept. But Kevin woke up and began to fight back. Kevin managed to get out of his bed and began crawling towards the door, but the killer caught up to him and then mortally wounded him with a slash to the throat. The screams that woke Maggie up were the sounds of her brother's dying moments. Maggie's appearance in the hall surprised the killer, who didn't realize she'd be home from college. But once she fled to get help, the killer forgot about her and just went back to the parents' room and slashed Lisa's throat, killing her as well. The killer then walked downstairs and casually washed their hands in the bathroom before slipping out the sliding glass door in the kitchen back out into the night. Alec had been carrying his horrendous secret around for weeks until he just couldn't bear it any longer. His rage over what had happened had grown day by day until he couldn't take it anymore and he decided to kill himself. But when he ended up in a mental hospital and got rejected by the girl he liked, Alec realized there were worse things than being dead. With no way to die and nothing to live for, Alec decided he might as well tell the secret. And the secret was that he, Alec, was the killer. Alec offered almost nothing in way of explanation for what he had done. He said only that his best friend, Kevin, had been annoying him lately, chewing too loudly at lunch and arguing a bit too much in their conversations. Alec said that initially he planned only to kill Kevin and smother him with a pillow. But once he got inside the house, he just decided to stab everyone to death. A month later, he told his parents he felt no regrets. In fact, he was still wearing the hush puppy shoes he wore the night he murdered the Haynes family. All the pieces now fit into place for Detective Lead and his team. Alex's shoes matched the bloody footprints, and police found the flashlight as well as the baseball hat with duct tape over the logo in the woods behind the Haynes' house. They also found a ghastly note in Alex's desk at his house. The note said that Alexander, which is Alex's full name, was born at 3:30 a.m. on May 12th, right after the murders, as though the slaughter had led to Alex's rebirth. Alec pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in 2008, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Then, in January of 2014, Alec made good on his suicide threats, hanging himself in his prison cell. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold, there might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what, we got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree because at least that way they're off the ground. They'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of this situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops and he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together, like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially, the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. Our next story is called Into Infinity. On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they had made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet. And so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all 3 sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there, and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp, down the trail, and they find their instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall to get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do. And they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water, he went around the corner so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a moulin, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. But after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went, deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark, and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet, and so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Signal. On the morning of August 7, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. The splash it made was surprisingly loud in the total silence that surrounded him. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska that was actually inside the Arctic Circle. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake, which was surrounded on all sides by forest and huge snowy mountains. And during this 5-month trip, Carl had not seen or spoken to another person the entire time. There were no phones, no roads, no rangers, no people around for at least 100 miles. I mean, this is true isolation. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. But as he listened, he couldn't hear anything. But this didn't worry Carl, because he actually had only arranged for his pickup date, not the pickup time. So it was just at some point on this day he was going to get picked up. He didn't know exactly when. And so as he anxiously waited, he just kind of puttered around his campsite and continued to pack up his things. And as Carl did this, he remembered that the type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane, it was really small. And there was a chance that he couldn't actually fit all of his belongings on the plane. And so in anticipation of this, he had identified that he didn't need all of his ammo. And so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake, basically in preparation for pickup. Just then, a breeze kicked up, and so Carl zipped his parka up to his chin. This was actually the so-called warm season in the Arctic Circle, but warm in the Arctic Circle meant still near freezing temperatures at night. And as much as Carl loved being out in the wilderness, doing these solo camping trips out in the middle of nowhere, he really was excited to get back to his home in Anchorage, Alaska, and see his friends and call his dad and, be in a nice warm house for once. Carl was about to chuck his 6th and final box of ammunition into the lake when he heard the loud sound of a wolf howling on the other side of the lake, and it made him stop for a second, and he decided that, maybe until the plane gets here, I'll hold on to at least 1 box of ammunition. So he stuck this final box into his bag, he picked it up, and then he walked along the shoreline up to where he had rigged a net to catch some fish. And when he got to the net, he saw he had caught 2 trout. And so he scooped the fish out, he went back to his campsite, he made a fire, cooked the fish, and as he sat down to eat them, he just kept looking up to the sky and listening, hoping for this plane to arrive soon. When he was done eating, Carl made a quick entry into his diary, kind of detailing the last day at camp. And then he finished packing up all his stuff, and he brought it all down to the waterline, ready to be picked up, and then he sat on his trunk, again, just kind of waiting for his friend to show up. And by this time, it was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. But nonetheless, Carl sat there kind of taking in the scene, this beautiful lake and nature. I mean, this is the last time he's going to be here, and so he's trying to appreciate it. After all, this had been a really successful photography trip. He had shot 500 rolls of film that he knew he could sell, and that would make enough money that he'd be able to do this again the following year. And so as Carl sat there taking in the scene and daydreaming about next year's trip, he noticed the sun was beginning to set. And when he noticed this was kind of like the first time that Carl actually became worried. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. And so if the sun was setting right now, that meant it had to be near midnight. And so his friend Rory, who was supposed to pick him up today at some point today, well, now that we've hit midnight, Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date. And Carl had no way of contacting him to see what had happened or when he would be here. And so as dusk fell, and still there was no sign of Rory, Carl continued to get more and more anxious. And finally, he had to reset up his tent, and he crawled inside, got in a sleeping bag, and went to sleep praying that his friend would be there the next day. The next day, Carl got up early and packed up his stuff and waited by the shoreline for his friend, but all day he waited, and the plane still never came. Carl tried to convince himself that, maybe his friend got mixed up on the dates, or, maybe something came up that's delayed him a couple of days, but he'll be here. But then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. And it was around this time that Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. I mean, these guys were just laughing and having a good time. And at some point, as the beers were flowing, Carl had asked Rory, "Hey, can you pick me up on August 7th at the end of my trip?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, I can probably do that." But Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first before he could 100% commit to this. And Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip and getting ready for it and all that, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. And so now Carl was realizing that Rory wasn't delayed or mixed up about the dates. Rory wasn't coming. And Carl knew there was zero chance of another plane just happening to fly over the area and that plane picking him up. I mean, for the entire summer Carl had been out here, he had literally not seen any planes. His best hope was that his dad or maybe one of his friends would report him missing. But he knew that was unlikely, and it actually was his own doing. Carl traveled constantly and almost never told people where he was going or when he'd be back. And on one trip recently, Carl had gone out and missed his return date, and his dad had been concerned about him and so called the police. And when Carl had come back and realized what his dad did, he told his dad to never do that again. "Never contact authorities if I'm late. I'm fine." And all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself with limited supplies and only a single box of ammunition. A few weeks later, at the end of August, Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up, and Carl was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake. He figured he had two choices. The first one was that he could just stay put and hope to be rescued. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food and also firewood near his campsite, so he wouldn't starve to death and he wouldn't freeze. But this would only keep him alive. This would not actually get him rescued. The other choice was that Carl could pack up his campsite and attempt to basically hike out of here 75 miles to the nearest city, called Fort Yukon. Now, this could get him home, but with it came a much higher chance of death. If Carl did the hike, well, those 75 miles would be over extremely rough terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. And so one little slip up and he could fall and get hurt or get lost. And also finding food was sort of a toss-up, and the weather at best would be brutal and at worst would be fatal. Plus, the entire region those 75 miles were in was absolutely teeming with wolves. Carl knew both of these choices were bad, but he was running out of time to make a decision. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if Carl was going to attempt this horrible hike, he would really have to do it soon. And so as Carl thought about what he was going to do, he trudged his way over to one of his rabbit snares, and he was so happy to see he had caught a rabbit. And so he took the rabbit back to his camp and he cooked it over the fire, and as he's eating it, he's thinking, you know what, this isn't so bad. I caught food for now. I mean, this will keep me alive at least for a couple of days. You know, maybe I should just stay here. But deep down, he knew the staying put option was not a real option. I mean, even though, yes, by staying here, he could keep himself from starving, he knew how to get food and all that, well, he'd still be a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and there were many, and remember, he only has one box of ammunition. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound, the distant whine of a small plane engine. At first, he thought he must be hearing things. Remember, he has not seen a plane at all since he got here. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp, low and slow. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange. He ran outside of his tent and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers, and so he figured his friends must have reported him missing, and now the police were out to rescue him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. Carl looked right at the pilot's eyes, and when Carl was nearly certain he had just made eye contact with the pilot, he threw his fist up in the air in excitement and jumped up and down. He couldn't believe it. He was saved. The pilot was going to land and take him home. With a big grin on his face, Carl watched as this plane, sure enough, made a big U-turn, and then Carl watched the plane make another pass over the camp, low and slow, which Carl figured meant, the pilot was looking for a place to land. And so as the pilot was doing that, Carl rushed to his campsite and began packing everything up. And as he did, he's kind of keeping an eye out, watching the plane, looking for it to land, but it didn't. The plane just kept on flying straight away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. For the rest of the day, Carl just stared off into the distance, hoping for this plane to come back, but it didn't. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He was so shaken up by what had happened that day. He didn't understand, he saw the pilot. The pilot seemed like they were looking back at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl told himself that, maybe the terrain was too rough and there was no way for the pilot to land. That was possible. And so perhaps this pilot was flying back and getting another plane, maybe a float plane to land on the water. Carl didn't know, but he felt like that could be a possibility, and it sort of made him feel a little bit better. But he still couldn't relax enough to sleep. And so, knowing he was just going to lay there all night, he sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read, just to occupy his mind. Now, at this point, Carl has been out in the wilderness all alone for months and months, and he's been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books and all of his magazines like 1,000,000 times. He's even read his diary 12 times. He's read everything. And so as he was looking around his tent, he was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly, he found something. His hunting license. It was like the one thing he had not closely read. Not an exciting thing to read, but new. It was just a little paper certificate with some rules and regulations and safety tips about hunting. And so Carl just began reading the front, and he read it all the way down. And then he flipped it over and he continued reading. But then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first he thought maybe he misunderstood. But no, he read it over and over again, and it was very clear. And so Carl looked up in shock. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. For weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp, just hoping and praying that somehow, some way, that plane would still come back, but it never did. And by the time Carl had actually accepted this fact that really the plane's not coming back, well, by that point, it was too late to try to hike out. So all he could do was stay put. However, the lake had frozen over, so he couldn't fish. His snares all sat empty because all the wolves and foxes got to his catches before he could. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him today. His food stores were totally gone, and the Arctic winter was getting so bad. In fact, his fingers and toes were turning black from frostbite, and he was sick all the time and constantly had chills. And as Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out the tent flap at his dying fire, knowing he had no more firewood. He knew he only had one choice left to make. He scratched a final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he set his diary on the floor of the tent near his rolls of film. Then he reached for his rifle and his last box of ammo. A little while later, a single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, in early February of 1982, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. He had taken his own life. What Carl had only realized later was that when he made that fist pump, when he was so excited when that pilot had flown overhead and he thought he was going to get rescued, well, that fist pump had sealed his fate. Because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. And so when that Alaska State Trooper pilot flew over Carl's camp, he did make eye contact with Carl. He saw him, but he also saw Carl raising his fist in the air and thought he was okay and so he turned around and he left. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised 2 hands in the air as the pilot flew over for the universal sign that means, pick me up.
Stay. Coffee shop lights still fade the same way. Then I see your shadow under neon rain, like all these months just disappeared again. You smile first, but your eyes look tired, like we both survived our own small fires. Funny how a stranger knows me best. Even after everything we left, we don't ask where the other's been. We don't touch, we just pretend. But silence says what words can't do. The past still lies between me and you. We once loved so deeply, now just a broken in-betweens, and our eyes already said goodbye. You said
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.